Hello, good people. Welcome to another episode of The Flow, one of the homes of independent commentary. We're happy you're here. And if you like what you hear and you know that somebody needs it, please comment, share, and subscribe. So today we're going to get into something that is a little bit edgy. It's a little bit edgy from a few different perspectives, but one of us, and we all kind of remember when this administration first came in, one of the first things they started talking about was this DEIA stuff. Something about diversity and how they didn't like this and it was so woke, and all those woke folks wanted to shove it down, and it was almost as if there was reverse discrimination, like that the privileged people, white males, were being worked against. They were being uh, kicked out of workplaces because all of the people that didn't look like them were being asked in. And that's not what it was about at all. But it was a good way for the administration to get some attention. And I kind of bring up that memory because today in the studio, we've got Michael Bach, who is a DEIA specialist. And one of the first questions when we started talking about this podcast is I said, well, what exactly does a DEIA specialist do? So Michael's going to explain that to us. And we're also going to get into some interesting conversations about things like the difference between equality and equity and whether or not this DEIA stuff is really destroying America or whether maybe it is actually of some benefit. I think business folks say so. Isn't that right, Michael?
Absolutely. This is the approach that a lot of organizations are taking is that a focus on DEIA is not just about a moral imperative, it's about what's good for the economy, what's good for the top and bottom line.
Just generally speaking, why does business feel that DEIA or diverse workforces is helpful to their bottom line?
Ultimately, it's about self-interest. It's about organizations wanting to make as much money as possible. Or in the case of nonprofits, do as much with the money that they have. And to do that, they need to make sure that their workforce is as productive as possible. And when you look at all of the research, people that don't feel like they matter, that don't feel like they belong in an organization, they're not going to be as productive. And so for any employer, a focus on DEIA is just about making sure that their employees are productive, that they feel included, that they feel valued, so that they continue to contribute to that organization. If I'm excluded for any reason, I'm not going to be as connected to the job. I'm not going to care as much. And the reality is that we have a diverse population. It is dramatically changing. And the days of having a workforce made up of straight, white, able-bodied men are gone. And I'm not saying that in a way to say that that's, that straight, white, able-bodied men are bad or that they should be excluded. I'm saying that the demographics have shifted. And employers need to keep up with those demographics. They can only hire the people who have the skills to do the job. And the reality is those people look a lot different than they did, say, 50 or 60 years ago.
So what I'm hearing you say is that a lot of us, when we think about DEIA, our minds immediately go to the hiring process. But what you're saying is that the DEIA concept and the thinking goes way beyond hiring.
Oh, absolutely. First of all, it's the entire life cycle of the employee. So it's about hiring. It's about promoting, retaining. It's about, keeping them in the organization as much as getting them in the organization. But it's also about the customer. It's also about how you talk about your organization, your communications, your suppliers, your facilities. Are they accessible? Are they inclusive? You know, there's a bit of a famous story of a large company that decided they wanted to get into the Latin Hispanic market. And they opened stores in predominantly Hispanic communities, and they put out advertisements that were appealing to that community. And on day one, the community walked into those stores and no one spoke Spanish. Like, what a complete screw up that was. And of course, what happened then was the community looked at the organization and said, okay, how many Hispanic executives do you have? What's your development program for Hispanic employees? Do you have a Hispanic employee resource group? You know, all of the fundamental trimmings of a DEIA program, and none of it existed. So it's not just about a cash grab. It's about authenticity in this work. And it being core to what you're doing.
So, I think that there is this sensation, this feeling that whole question. I mean, well, let's get the words down. So DEI means diversity, equity, inclusion, and
Accessibility.
accessibility. Diversity. When we say diversity, immediately that brings up this issue. And I think that there's a lot of people, I think more on one side than the other, that thinks of that as a zero-sum game. In other words, if you hire more of those people, you'll hire less of my people. And that, I think, is what the fearmongers jump on.
Sure.
And I'm not saying, and in a certain way, it kind of makes sense, because there are only so many hires that are to be made. And if you hire one of those people, then you're not hiring one of my people. So there's a certain, I guess, tactical feeling-ish truth to that. So how do we look at that from a DEIA perspective and kind of deconstruct that narrative?
Sure. So first off, the word diversity in the dictionary essentially means different. Doesn't mean different from. It isn't a baseline that says you are diverse if you are not a straight, white, able-bodied man. By definition, straight, white, able-bodied men are different. They are diverse because they're different from me. I'm gay. I live with a disability. They are diverse. I am diverse. They are diverse. It is about everyone's differences and recognizing that we all have a lot of differences. And those differences can be things like gender and sexuality and race, but they can also be about things like where in the country you live. What's your degree in? Do you have post-secondary education? Did you grow up in poverty? You know, there are so many things that define who we are and how we see the world. Diversity is about all of those things. I want to be very clear to say that straight, white, able-bodied men have never been marginalized. They have never been discriminated against. That is not something historically that we have seen. But they are still diverse. And when we talk about DEIA, it's about creating workplaces where everyone can bring every aspect of themselves to work. And there isn't a quote unquote normal. There isn't a situation where someone is normal and someone is outside of that norm. Everyone's normal. Ultimately, yes, you're right. When we go through the hiring process, it's all about exclusion. We post a job, we might get 500 applicants for that job. We're hiring one person. So we then have to exclude people from that process. That's how hiring works. But the question is, why are you excluding them? So if you're excluding a person, let's say I'm going through 500 resumes and I'm excluding people because they don't have the skills to do the job, that is totally justifiable. I don't care if they're a leprechaun or a unicorn. It doesn't matter. If they don't have the skills, they shouldn't be in there in the pool. But if I'm excluding them because they went to, I don't know, a university that is the, and, you know, arch nemesis of my university, well, that has nothing to do with the person's ability to do the job. If I'm excluding them because I can't pronounce their name, because they went to a historically black college or university, because they're a woman, if I'm excluding them because maybe they grew up in India and they went to something called the Indian Institute of Technology, and I've never heard of that, and it's not an Ivy League school, well, frankly, you just made a big fat mistake, because the IIT is the most difficult school on the planet to get into. If you're excluding someone because of something that has nothing to do with their ability to do their job, that's the wrong reason.
Well, that it kind of makes my sense of privilege a little less worth it makes it makes my sense of privilege worth a little less. Like, um and I guess that is the pain for people that are saying that it's a zero-sum game. In other words, I've got to compete on an even field now, instead of having a sense that I should get the job merely because of what color my skin is.
Exactly. And that's where I think people have gotten their nose out of joint, is we are trying to level that playing field, not for the sake of harming anyone, but for making sure that everyone has the opportunity. If they have the skill, they can do the job. But being white is not a skill. That is not a contributing factor to why someone is better or worse at a job. And I say this as a white man. That should never be part of the consideration. I'll give you an example.
Mhm.
Up until the 1970s, orchestras around the world were predominantly white men. Musicians and orchestras were predominantly white men because, believe it or not, it was a belief that women's hands weren't strong enough to hold the instruments. And in the 1970s, orchestras started auditioning musicians behind a screen. And overnight, the number of women and people of color in orchestras went through the roof. Because all that matters as a musician is the output, is the music that you make. It has nothing to do with anything else. So they took all of the privilege out of the situation, and things changed dramatically. That's what we're trying to do. Yes, it is going to be a bit of a pain in the butt for some people who have gone through life riding on their privilege, but that's life, man. And the reality is that employers are missing out on really great talent if they can't get out of their own way.
Hmm. You know what? It makes me think of two things with music. Now that you mentioned music, it makes me think of the dueling banjos scene from Deliverance.
Yeah,
And it makes me think of that song, "The Devil Went Down to Georgia," where they had the two duels, and the kid who had his special abilities up on the porch. Uh, After that dueling banjo scene, I remember the visitor came and said, "Wow, man, that guy can play," and that's all that mattered. It
that's
didn't
all that
matter
matters.
that he was born differently. Um, didn't matter. He
It
could
doesn't
play.
matter. That's all that matters. It's simply about a person's ability to do a job, whether that job is musician, accountant, plumber, doesn't matter. It's just about a person's ability to do the job.
Hmm. And even so, how has this become how has this become so weaponized?
That's the $64,000 question, isn't it? I would say a couple things, Bob.
Wait, I just got to stop
Yeah.
you there for a second. For those of you who aren't as old as Michael and me,
Robert,
I
what
got
are
to
you
tell you, there
suggesting?
once was a TV show called The $64,000 Question, and people answered questions. And as long as they were right, they got more and more prize money. And the very, very top prize money was $64,000, which back in the 60s was a lot of
Was
money.
a lot of money, although it's actually a very strange number when you think about it. Why not 70,000? But never mind.
Right.
Yes. So it is ultimately an important question. And I would say there are a couple things that I think about. And I'm not going to get political because I just have no interest in it. I think some of the people who have been doing DEIA work over the years have been doing it in a way that has left people behind. And so I've been doing this work for over 20 years. And when I started doing the work, it was very much about women, people of color, indigenous people, people with disabilities, and members of the LGBTQ plus communities. Nowhere was there a conversation about straight, white, able-bodied men. And I was one of the first people to say, hold on. If this is about inclusion, it's about inclusion for everyone. I recognize we're trying to overcome things like bias and privilege and decades of marginalization. But the only way we do that is by bringing everyone along. And I think there's a lot of people who've been doing this work who view it as a zero-sum game and say this is about everyone else benefiting and straight, white, able-bodied men losing. I fundamentally disagree with that principle. And I think the consequence of that over several decades is that we have a population of people who feel that DEIA work is about everyone but them, and they feel left out. And I think the second is that the pendulum swing has been too fast. Too much, too fast. And if you think about a pendulum swinging from one side to the other as a change analogy, it goes from one side and it swings all the way over the other, and the change doesn't stick. Whereas what we really want is the pendulum just to be swinging slightly in the center so that the change has time to take hold. When George Floyd was brutally murdered in 2020, there was a massive outcry, understandably. Not because Mr. Floyd was the first African American to be killed by police. He wasn't the first that year or that week to be killed by police. But it was because a lot of people who had never experienced that, whether they're white or otherwise, could not look away from that video. The consequence then was a lot of organizations jumping on a bandwagon that they weren't ready to be on. And a lot of change happened really fast. And we left people behind. And while I'm a big fan of change, I'm a fan of change that sticks. And the change didn't stick because when the current president started to make noise about DEIA, companies unfolded like a cheap card table. Like overnight, companies were backing away from their DEI efforts, even though they had said, this is integral to our business. Well, if it was integral to your business, how did you undo it so quickly? And I think what that tells me, rather, is that we didn't embed it into the fabric of the organization. They didn't really believe it. We made them feel guilty. And that doesn't affect change.
You know, that whole idea of making people feel guilty about being in favor of change does have some pushback, and it does have some blowback. And are you saying that that's what the woke, the people that scream, the point at the left and say those woke people are destroying America? Is that an expression kind of the advocacy and power and speed that people wanted these things to be adopted?
I think to some extent, sadly.
And then on the other side, I can think back to a conversation between Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King, where Lyndon was saying to MLK, you know, we have to take these things gradually. People don't accept change so gradually. And he said, we have been gradual for 200 years. It is time. And so I guess timing and the speed with which you go forward with change is just one of those things that people can be not wrong, but not always so right. And it's like feeling the pie as is it done yet? No, it's still a little springy. Is it overdone now? It's too hard. And I had a mentor who once, if I can tell you this little story, I practiced in Miami. There were 14 felony trial courts going, and on Monday they call the calendar for all 14. So all of the defendants and all of the prosecutors and all of the defense attorneys and everybody was in that courthouse on Monday morning. And every 13 of the courtrooms were packed solid. And there was one courtroom that was not. It was my mentor, Justice Gerald Cogan. And one day I went down and I said, Justice, because he did become Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. I said, Judge, how come? You know, you walk into your courtroom, it's like an oasis. And he says, you know, Bob, I just don't think that some of the other judges, they get too personal. And they feel that when somebody asks for a continuance, it's an attack on their process. So they tend to force things to trial that have to be done over. Or when somebody really wants to go to trial and they give it a suspension when it was ripe, and now it drops and rots, and now it's got to be cleaned up. So, you know, you have to have a sense of timing when something's ready to go, and then you have to be ready to move when it is. But those are real questions of wisdom. And although I guess we might practice wisdom on an individual basis, and hopefully it grows over our lifetime, on a societal or cultural basis, it's much more like trying to turn an oil tanker. You know?
Yeah. Your comment about Dr. King, who was very right, by the way, also reminds me of conversations between President Woodrow Wilson and Alice Paul and members of the suffrage movement of the early 1900s, where the president and political leaders at the time just kept saying, we need more time. We need more time before women get the right to vote. How much time do we need? Here's what I would say, though, is that the reality with President Wilson, with whoever, was they weren't actually making progress. They were just kicking the can down the road. And the same is the case in a lot of organizations who say they have a DEIA effort. But then you look at their leadership development program, and continually people from the same group are getting promoted. And there's no development program from people who don't look like me. Well, that's not progress. You're not actually doing the work. I have described DEIA efforts like this. It's like driving a car up a hill without brakes. if you take your foot off the gas for a second, you're going backward. You don't need to be doing 100 miles an hour up the hill, but you do at least need to be going 1 mile an hour up the hill. There needs to be some movement forward. And the reality is that this isn't magical work. It's real work. There are tasks to be done to make sure that A, you're bringing in the best and the brightest, B, you're keeping them in the organization, and C, you're promoting them through the organization. It's not going to happen on its own. And I'll give you a statistic that tells me exactly that it's not happening on its own. The year in which women in the United States started taking home more than 50% of undergraduate degrees. Now, usually I'll ask an audience what they think, and often it'll be say, 2006 or 1997. It was 1979, 1980. Women took home 54% of undergraduate degrees, and it has not dropped below 50% since then. So then I look at the number of women who are CEOs of the Fortune 500. There are more men named John who are CEOs of the Fortune 500 than there are women. You cannot tell me that in 40 plus years, 45 years, that women have not developed the skills that they need in order to be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. What has gotten in the way? Bias, privilege, all sorts of things. We need to be making the progress. We need to be moving forward so that in another 100 years, we're not still having this conversation.
True. So let me ask you again, just so that we're understanding terms. People hear the word equity. I think it's a little mysterious to folks. And they kind of think that it is equality, like we're going to be equal. Let me start off the conversation with one of my favorite memes that really, I think, describes it wonderfully. And it is 4 people on bicycles. It's a young boy on a tricycle. It's a no-legged vet on a wheelchair with a hand crank, laying back three-wheel wheelchair with a hand crank. There's an old guy who's on a big tricycle, and then there's a middle-aged woman on a regular bicycle. Now, they are certainly not equal, because some of those bicycles are more expensive than others, to be honest, right? To have a specialized bicycle is a little bit more expensive, but it wasn't about the cost of it making it equal, and it wasn't about giving them the same bike. It was about giving them the same access to be able to move themselves and transport. So I always love that meme, but you take it from here.
It's a great analogy, and there's lots of different ones. And I'll say this. The word equal suggests that we are the same, that we have the same opportunity, that we have the same skills, that we have the same background, and that everything is equal. That's a bit of a myth. Like when you go through a recruiting process and you get down to 2 candidates and you look at them, there's going to be some difference. They're not going to be equal. Equity is about recognizing that we don't have all the same needs. To your meme explanation, those 4 characters didn't need the same thing. Equality would have been giving them all the same bike and expecting that they would adapt to that bike. But obviously, a veteran who doesn't have legs cannot adapt to the same bike that a middle-aged woman can use. Equity is about recognizing that difference exists. And it's about adapting to the needs of the individual. It's about making sure that you're creating space where people can bring their diversity and still succeed. So, as an example, if it's about having a Zoom meeting, you're having a Zoom meeting, turn the captions on. For people who have hearing impairment, those captions are their access. It gives them the ability to participate. If it is about, I don't know, people who have English as a secondary language, so people who didn't grow up speaking English, it's about translating a document into Spanish or Mandarin or whatever language so that they can understand. That's not about saying that somehow English is no longer the language of the country. It's not. It's about making sure that people understand the information they're receiving. And I'll tell you a bit of an anecdote that exemplifies this. A friend of mine, mother-in-law from China, not great English. She went to the doctor. Doctor's giving her some news. She's there with her husband, also not great English. Nodding. Doctor thinks everything is understood. She leaves. 2 weeks later, phone rings. Her daughter happens to be at the house, answers the phone. It's the doctor's office. Why hasn't Mrs. Chen come in for her appointment? Daughter doesn't know anything about the appointment. What do you mean? She had stage 4 breast cancer. And the doctor had been relaying that information in English to her, expecting that she understood everything that he was saying. And it wasn't until the daughter got involved and said, okay, now I understand. She got treatment. She's fine. But that's equity. The doctor should have recognized, hold on, I'm not sure that this patient has full understanding of the language. I need to make sure that there's an interpreter here so that we fully grasp what is being received. Again, that doesn't make English somehow not the language of the land. It is to say that not everybody speaks English as well as others. Mm-hmm. It's about making sure that we consider people's needs in these decisions we're making that at times can be life and death.
So let me share a similar anecdote.
Please.
So I speak Spanish fluently. I was gifted with this because I grew up in a carnival, and the carnival went to Mexico for a year when I was 9 years old. And my folks got tired of me, and they dumped me in a Spanish-speaking boarding school for 7 months. So I learned Spanish. But be that as it may, I came to North Carolina in 1988, a rural county, and they were just beginning to get some Mexican workers who had begun to come into the county. And of course, and part of that population, got in trouble, mostly drunk driving, and other, things like that. And so they would wind up in court. And the county was of a awareness at that point where the judges thought that if they talk louder,
right, so louder and slower.
Louder and slower, that they would understand anything. Well, I got a job as a DA, a prosecutor here, and I was the only Spanish-speaking bilingual person in town. So I wound up not only prosecuting these poor folks, but translating
for them
as well.
Oh my gosh.
And, move a couple of years forward, like you say, how change comes about. Move a couple of years forward, and we started saying, oh, we need to have translators. And so we need to have certified translators.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
Slowly we started, and then all of a sudden we started getting Nigerians. And then we started getting these folks. And And how are we going to do this? And how is the system going to work? Well, finally now, so that would be 40 years almost later, in the last 5 or 10 years, now we have a telephone system where you can dial a number and get a translator in any one of 47 different languages who will translate on the phone. And you're right. I mean, nobody in the courtroom wants to convict somebody that doesn't understand why they're being convicted. I mean, in our hearts, we just don't want to take advantage of somebody and, throw them in jail because they didn't speak the language. But, the flip side of that is another question that I wanted to ask you. What happens when, cultures not only mix, but when they conflict?
Mm-hmm. And they do.
Now huh?
It can conflicts. Any change will create conflict.
I don't like the way this guy wears their hair. I don't like, patchouli. And he comes in, he smells like patchouli. I don't like that. I don't like that smell. It's not right. He shouldn't smell of anything when he comes in. How do we, there's the cost, there's the psychic course, there's all of these costs associated with it. Is it fair to ask people to endure that?
Here's what I would say. We are a country of immigrants. And the immigrant that came to this country 250 years ago was white from England. And that lasted a while. And when I say we are a country of immigrants, I want to, with deference to the indigenous peoples of Alaska, Hawaii, the Native American, right? So, but 99% of the people who live in the United States, it's about 95% in Canada, are either immigrants of first generation, or in my case, I'm an 8th generation immigrant. My people have been on North American soils, or what we now call North American soils, for over 200 years. But my heritage is British, English, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. I'm a British mutt. I think a lot of people forget that because they were born here. Their parents were born here. Their parents' parents were born here. So we don't necessarily think about our heritage. So when someone arrives from Nigeria, China, Spain, Mexico, wherever, Venezuela, we're not thinking about the impact of immigrating to this country. It's incredibly stressful. People give up their lives in order to come to the United States, and it has an incredible burden. I believe that there's a balance there, that immigrants should not be expected 100% to adapt to the North American culture, that it's a melting pot. Bring your culture to this country and we will give you our culture. I think one of the things we do a horrible job at is integration of newcomers. There isn't a lot of effort put behind the integration of newcomers to understand the cultural norms of what it means to live here. And so people bring their culture to this country, and one of two things happen. They either entirely give up their culture and try desperately to adapt to the American culture, or they hold on to their culture and they end up in, for lack of a better word, ghettos, cultural ghettos, where, as an example, there are parts of Miami where people don't speak Spanish because they've created a ghetto predominantly of Cubans who live in that city and don't speak any English. And not because they're not willing to, they just have never learned. And we see that in other parts of the country. And I think it is beneficial to everyone that we do a better job of integration, not to make immigrants into some sort of stereotypical American, but for us to get to know their culture and them to get to know ours. It is a 50-50. And I think it's a good thing because people bring some amazing things. Look at the food we have in this country,
Yeah, right.
right? The food alone. And I'm somebody who likes to eat. So the Mexican food and the Peruvian food and the Chinese food, well, that didn't magically appear. That came from immigrants who brought those recipes to this country and then opened restaurants and people adapted it and so on and so forth. There's so many benefits that come from bringing others to this country. Yes, it's going to be different. It's going to make you uncomfortable for a bit.
And it's going to cost.
And it's going to cost.
It's going to cost. I guess the question, really comes down, in a very simplistic way to that. Are we willing to pay the cost both in our own energy to adapt and accept, and psychically and spiritually, but also financially? These things cost. But what kind of a world do we want to live in eventually? And
Yeah.
is that the way to get there? And I don't think that that you can debate that. I don't even think people that go around screaming about the political correctness police and the woke liberals and own the libs and all that. I don't even think, if you ask them the question, do you think people should be excluded from working based on their race? If you go right down to the nuts and bolts of it, I don't even believe that they would say yes. I mean, they'll start thinking about,
Sure.
the trade-offs and the zero-sum game ideas and things like that. But I don't think anybody really feels that anybody ought to be. I suppose the objection comes when people feel like the imposition of a diverse culture is happening too fast and too much, and it's and the truth of the matter, I think, is what I'm hearing you say, is the truth of the matter is that the statistics just don't support that.
They don't. And there's a couple things I'll say. First of all, to people who think that immigration is a bad thing and we should just close our borders or we should only accept immigrants from, better countries.
South Africa and Sweden.
Right. Here's the thing. They're not leaving their countries. If you look at the out migration, so people leaving their countries in places like Sweden and Finland and the Nordic countries, in Europe, in the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, they're not leaving. Their out migration numbers are incredibly low versus their in migration numbers. People are leaving countries like India and China and Nigeria and Haiti because the circumstances there are really not good. So we have to accept the immigrants that are willing to come, first off. We as a country are in population decline. It's a fact. It's not something I'm making up. The Bureau of Statistics all their data shows it, that our birth rate.
Are you talking about birthright population decline or overall, including immigration?
Just birth rate. So we're in population decline because our birth rate is 1.6.
People that are American citizens are dying faster than they're being born.
Correct.
Okay.
We have a birth rate of 1.6, and what that means is that for every woman of childbearing years, and I put that in quotes because I think it's a weird thing, but there's a range, they are having 1.6 children. in order to maintain our population, so 1 in, 1 out, we need a birth rate of 2.1. To put it in context, in the baby boomer generation of the 1940s and 50s, it was 4.0. So we're going the wrong direction. We need immigration to maintain our population. Why we need to maintain our population is because there are jobs to be done. And those jobs, we need people to do those jobs. Never mind grow as a country. We're just talking about maintaining our population. We have to have immigration. And the reality is we have to take the immigrants where they're coming from. So you can fight it. You can be uncomfortable with the change. You can say, oh, there's, too many brown and black people in my community now, and they weren't here before. This wasn't the way it always was. Well, let me take you back 250 years almost, not quite 250 years, but let's say the late 1800s and the migration from Ireland, the great migration from Ireland, when there was massive famine and no jobs, and people arrived on these shores. And the people who were already here, all of British heritage, English heritage mostly, hated the Irish and made them feel excluded and put them into the worst kind of situations. And the jobs were terrible and they paid them less. Okay, because it was change. And now, of course, a person moves from Ireland to the United States and they're part of the dominant group. They're white. They, yes, they talk with a funny accent, but if you've ever been to Boston, so does everyone there. That change takes time. The thing about change is our brains get uncomfortable. It's a long story why. The way you get used to change is by exposing yourself to it. And it's about just getting used to that thing that's different. So the thing that made you uncomfortable yesterday, you're a little more comfortable with today, and you'll be more comfortable with it tomorrow. And eventually it just becomes part of the scenery. Think when I came out of the closet, it was 1987. And I assure you, there was no such thing as Will and Grace or RuPaul's Drag Race. We were vilified as a community. It was the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. It was a horrible time for members of the LGBTQ plus communities. Today, we have a former Secretary of Transportation who's gay. We have CEOs of Apple. The CEO of Apple, or outgoing CEO of Apple, is gay. We have prominent LGBTQ members of Congress. We have leaders. We have a massive change. It has taken nearly 40 years. Now, the trans community is getting the end of the stick on this one. But for someone like me, cisgender, white man, no one really cares that I'm gay. It's pretty irrelevant now. There are still pockets that do, but for the most part, change happens. It takes time.
I'm old enough and you're old enough, but I don't know if you, I'm sure something similar happened in most cities, but I remember in the 60s, might have been the early 70s, New York City, curb cuts.
Yes.
For curb cuts. There were no curb cuts.
No.
People that lived in wheelchairs stayed home and out of sight. There was no exposure to them. They couldn't go into buildings because there were elevators. Buildings had big steps in front of it. There were no ramps. But even crossing a street, there was no curb cut in the streets. And so just the mere act of getting around at all, forget about having elevators. Forget about it. Forget about having elevators and get down to the subway and things like that. So, you didn't see them. They were out of sight, out of mind. You didn't have to think about them. And then all of a sudden, somebody came up with a bright idea about curb cuts. And man, the city went nuts. It's going to cost, and what are the engineers going to say, and the developers and the contractors and everything? It was going to cost billions of dollars, and it was going to be this, and everybody's going to have to walk around construction sites, and everywhere you go, there's going to be rocks. It was big. It was big. It was shaking the city. And now somebody's getting to the middle of the road and they want to cross, they want to go out to get their taxi. Somebody else will run up and help them move the wheelchair down, because we just do that. That's who
Right.
we are. That's who we are today. You know, there's nothing that's strange or weird about somebody in a wheelchair, somebody that needs a little help getting across. And even the people that are in the wheelchair, who at one time were embarrassed to accept help, now say thank you, and it ain't no
Sure.
big deal. Yeah, just saying, I appreciate it. Thanks. You know, just
Absolutely.
like holding the door open for somebody or anything else is just a mere courtesy. And so, what was such a big thing, you know, has wound up to actually change who we are. And you know what? We feel better about it. I don't care what your political position is. You got to feel better about it. It makes you a happier person to know
Exactly.
that you're just doing what, you know, that guy, that wisdom teacher a couple thousand years ago said, love your neighbor.
Right. And can you imagine now looking at a person who uses a wheelchair and being like, oh, you shouldn't be out in public? But also, those ramps don't just help people who use wheelchairs. They help parents pushing strollers. They help delivery people who have carts. They help people who maybe you're not using a wheelchair, you're using a cane or a walker. They help people who just walk. But it just took some strong politician who said, no, we're going to do this. We need to make our city more accessible. In leading up to the 2012 Olympics in London, England, which is far older than the city of New York, they didn't have curb cuts, but they were bringing the Olympics to London. And one of the conditions was every single street corner had to have a curb cut, because they also get the Paralympics with the Olympics. So it can be done. It can be very painful. It can be very expensive. But now, can you imagine a world without curb cuts? Like, it's just so part of our day-to-day routine.
Mm-hmm.
Just like getting rid of the penny. I know people are really freaked out we're getting rid of the penny. But, you know, at some point we didn't actually have the penny. The penny was brought into our life hundreds of years ago, and now we're getting rid of it.
Wait a
And
minute. Wait a minute. Now, you just hit
oh no,
my
this is the
edge.
bridge.
We're getting rid of the penny? No, I can't go with that. No, no, I remember my penny candy. I remember my penny candy. I
Of
remember
course.
those little dots of sugar things put onto those little strips of, and you used to get a whole foot for a penny. No, now you pushing
That's
it.
a
You
bridge too
pushing it,
far.
Michael.
Listen, it's painful. People are up in arms. People are hoarding pennies. Okay. You're not going to stop the change. And in a couple years, no one will care. The penny will be gone. We'll have our process in place to round up or round down. Change is hard and it scares people, and I get that. But ultimately, it's better for us. Do you know why? The penny costs more to make than it's worth.
Mm-hmm.
I think it costs 1.2 cents to make a penny. So we as a country are losing money by making a penny. That's just a bad business decision. It's just stupid. You don't make something and then sell it for less than you made it. This is just the fundamentals of capitalism. Change is hard, but ultimately we will be better for it.
Okay. So, Michael, we're hitting up on almost an hour now. I'm going to ask you one last question.
Yes, sir.
And if you need a moment, it's okay. But can you give me and give our listeners a couple of tips of how to choose a candidate. We're coming up on a very important election. Let's not, pick any bones about it. The November elections are going to be quite important, no matter which side you're on. It's going to be a big, big thing. So when you look at choosing a candidate, what should a voter look for?
Yeah. Well, we're still in primary season. So I'll answer that part first, and then I'll answer the November question. I think the responsibility is on us as individuals to research our candidates and understand who's running and what their positions are and what they believe. And if those positions don't align with yours, don't vote for them. When it comes to the November election, to the midterms, I am not a person who believes in party loyalty. I say that as somebody who has voted for Republican and Democrat, who has voted for other candidates up and down the ballot. I often don't vote for the independents because they have such a hard time of getting elected. But in, municipal elections, that sort of thing, they have more chance. Again, research the candidate. The problem with a two-party system is you have two choices. And for people who say, well, I'm just not going to vote, you're voting. You just don't know it. People who didn't want to vote for Kamala Harris because whatever reason, I think I can point to a few like misogyny and racism, but people who couldn't vote for them but would consider themselves to be members of the Democratic Party, you voted for Trump. That's just how the math works out. So I think you have to have a really seriously hard look at yourself to say, if I don't, let's assume for sake of argument that you're somebody who's on the left political spectrum now or on the right. If you say to yourself, I can't vote for this candidate for whatever reason, look at the other candidate because that's who you're electing. Would you rather them? And that's the question you have to ask yourself. If you can't bring yourself to vote for the Republican, are you going to be happy with the Democrat? Because ultimately that's who you're electing by not voting for them. I remind people of this all the time. We live in a democracy that actually exists and arguably works. There are billions of people that live in countries that don't live in a democracy. China, as an example. They have elections, but they're completely controlled. There's one party. If you don't like our system, feel free to go and live in China, where you have no choice. You could go live in Iran or pick a country where the systems don't work, where there are dictators, where it's completely controlled. Never forget the honor that is and the privilege that comes with being able to step into a voting booth and make a choice that actually does have a potential impact. It's a tough call. I'm not going to tell you to vote for one party or another because I think who I
wasn't asking that.
Yeah, who I would tell you to vote for is going to change.
Right.
Research a candidate, find out what they stand for, ask the candidate questions. Don't vote blindly.
Well, I would say also that I hear this all the time. I think it may be rising to be one of my pet peeves. I'm picking, between two evils. I'm picking the least of two evils. And I want to say that if you have that thought, it's not true. It's not accurate, and I'm going to tell you why it's not accurate. Both of the candidates who you are choosing between had an incredible amount of discipline, an incredible amount of ambition. They had a lot of people skills. They were able to harness the force of multiple people to get to be the candidate of their party. So they're not inconsequential people. They're not lackards or slackards. They're not that. They may be very different. You may not like some of their policies, but to say it's the lesser of two bad choices, I think is a narrative that simply gives you an excuse not to vote your conscience.
I agree. And I would say,
And
I would
I
add,
say, I
yeah,
have 3 questions. I have 3 questions that you should ask.
yeah,
And I'm not as ambitious as you are, hoping that people will research their candidates
yeah.
deeply. And here are my 3 questions. 1, what is the world that this person is presenting that they want to create? And is that a world that you want to live in? Second, is this person appealing to my protective fears, or are they appealing to my better angels? And finally, is this person inclusive or exclusive? And if you can really sit down and answer those 3 questions, my friend, it will say as much about who you are as it will say about who your candidate is.
I agree. I would add one thing.
Go ahead.
You're never going to agree with every single position that a politician takes. That's not how life works. The question is not, do I agree with everything? The question is, how much do I agree?
And
And
where does he want to go?
yes,
You know, I mean,
what
how to
does
get
that
there
person
is
see for your
always up to
world?
debate. You know, I always think that the story of America is the struggle between our aspirations and our reality.
Mm-hmm.
It has been the story for 250 years. From the
Absolutely.
moment they said that all men are created equal and owned enslaved people
Yes.
to the very 6 o'clock news yesterday, it has been the struggle between what we aspire to be and the reality of what we are. And what that aspiration is. And I often, have conversations with people about how can you have conversations with people that think differently than you. And I say, as long as you both have an image, an aspiration of a country that's remotely identical, you can debate forever how to get there. But if your aspiration is a white male dominated 1950s woman in the kitchen, if that is where you want to go, God bless you. I mean, that's your aspiration. That's where you want to go. It's just not mine. And I don't want to go where you want to go. So, we need to part ways. But if we both want to go to the same place, well, we can figure out how to get there.
Agreed.
Love the conversation, Michael. Thank you so much for your time. You have a website, michaelbach.com, correct?
I do. Yes.
And that'll be in the show notes. And I don't know if I can speak for you, but if this has stimulated a question or somebody's in an organization, you're developing something, you're a solopreneur, an entrepreneur, and you're working on things and you're wondering how DEIA fits into your plans, Michael, can they call it? Can they go on
Absolutely.
the website, send you an email and ask a question?
Yeah, please do. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thanks for your time and your expertise and your wisdom. And if I can say it, thank you for your love.
Thank you very much.